Welcome to the Health Tech Edge. I'm Mike Moore, and my guest today is Chris Darland, CEO of Peerbridge Health. Chris spent years leading large finance teams at GE and Ecolab, then stepped into healthcare entrepreneurship with a clear goal: make heart diagnostics fast, affordable, and easy to access. Peerbridge uses a small wearable ECG machine learning to read clean signals in minutes with an aim to spot issues like heart failure and structural problems much earlier. We'll talk about the tech, how it fits into real clinics and homes, trust and privacy questions, and how payers might use this at population scale. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So let's get into it. Long finance career, a lot of things you've done over the course of it, and then you make this pivot specifically into heart diagnostics. What brought you into this space?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my lived experience with heart failure and heart disease seemingly was a never-ending trip to the ER for my grandfather growing up. And all my family's from rural Kentucky, a little bit outside of Louisville. And then I grew up largely in Cincinnati. So that meant that, my mom was taking off for a couple hour drive and then usually spending the evening and overnight in the hospital with my grandpa. It's I'm sure it feels a little bit more dramatic in my head than the reality of it. But the reality is that he was in and out of the hospital pretty continuously for most of my life. And as I started my career in GE, where my dad worked and both my grandfathers worked as well before them, I always had a little bit of an itch to see if I could get back into the healthcare space, because to me it felt intuitively a little bit broken that you'd need the hospital over and over and over again as opposed to getting to the root cause. But that said, I love my time at GE. I think I learned a tremendous amount. I have fantastic mentors there. The business was run, all the different businesses I was at were run exceptionally well, and kind of prepared me, I think, for this role where it'd say, all right, this is my chance to come back into a company with fantastic technology that I was an investor in initially, and try to make an impact and ultimately get to that initial goal of how do we prevent heart disease from being, terribly disruptive, not only to the patient, but to families, and extended families and caregivers as well. So it's been a humbling experience so far. It's a blessing to be in this position, and I think we've made a good amount of progress. We're pretty close to having a pretty big impact.
Yeah, that's great. I think, most people have, as I do these interviews on this podcast, just about everybody has some sort of story or connection to healthcare, because it's not like, other things in the world that people may or may not have a connection to, right? Like everyone has some connection to healthcare, either themselves as a patient, as a parent, as a caregiver, or, in your case, during your childhood years, right? Like just less time with your mother because she's occupied, but also less time with your grandfather because of his health issues and hospitalization, which I think many of us can relate to. I think the interesting opportunity for many of us, especially working in tech or other industries, is to look at some of the areas of healthcare that maybe haven't been touched in a bit, that are ripe for disruption. Yeah. And being able to take some of the technology that we take for granted in other industries and now bring it over and try to apply that disruptive strategy here and see what kind of results we can generate with it.
Yeah, you're describing quite well how we think through this business. And that's exactly right. It feels like, of course, healthcare touches everybody. I think that, thematically, our healthcare system is a little bit closer to a sick care system than a healthcare system. A lot of the incentives are set up to treat very sick people. My grandpa, as a great example, would probably look back at his health journey and say, what a miracle. Like I was in the hospital every 18 months, and every 18 months, I'm home again, which for sure is true. I mean, if it would have been 30 years prior, he probably would have passed away after the first heart attack, or you wouldn't have a pacemaker that's working 100%. But I think now we have an opportunity to say, hey, I think there's better than that. And the tools, in our view, kind of exist in other contexts, and now we have to bring them to the market in healthcare.
Yeah, I think the other point that I noticed before we get into the rest of things here is just the fact that depending on where people are, primarily in the United States, I think is our audience here, but, many of us in the world, you're near a big city, and we take for granted proximity to excellent care. I sit here in the Boston area with my family. We are very close to some of the world's best hospitals. In fact, I will admit that we're quite snobbish, even in our own community. We're about, 15, 16 miles outside of the city. There are local hospitals where we could have had our children, but we preferred to go to the city because you're so close to Boston. Like, why wouldn't you want to go have them at, Beth Israel or at Brigham, right? Those are kind of world-class places. If something were to go wrong, you've got Children's Hospital of Boston right there, like world-class institutions. But not everybody has that situation. Right? United States quite large, geographically distributed. You've got a lot of people living in rural communities where they may not have that quality of healthcare available to them, which again I think creates a circumstance where having something that can be with them from a diagnostic point of view, right? So that if that trip to the hospital is too long, too far, not
Yeah.
fast enough, that there are other things to kind of help assess a patient or those kind of things.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. And I would argue that most people don't have the situation that you're in. And I'm in Nashville, so I have a lot. Vanderbilt's fantastic, and Ascension and HCA both have huge footprints here. So I'm quite lucky as well. But my dad, as an example, lives in Springfield, Kentucky, so it's about an hour and a half, let's say, outside of Lexington. Doesn't have anything close. Lives at the end of a long gravel driveway. And where I think it becomes most impactful is, the finding heart failure. And we'll talk about some of this, but like finding heart failure isn't a new science. Clinicians and cardiologists know how to do it, but getting my dad to travel an hour and a half for a preventative visit that might take months to come to fruition is a loser's game for sure. And there's tens of millions of people just like him. So you're exactly right. It's how to, the science, the mystery is largely gone in cardiac care, but it's very centralized in big cities and lots of fantastic hospitals. But how do you make get that expertise to communities that in most cases need it more than the big cities in terms of risk of cardiac disease and diets in rural communities and higher smoking rates, all the things that lead to cardiac disease that kind of drive the need for care the most are the same things that keep the care further away. It's a big opportunity there.
Yeah, and so ideally, what we're doing instead of waiting for something bad to happen, the pain radiating down the left arm or,
Yeah.
whatever, all these kind of signs and things, chest pains and that stuff is we're doing screenings, right? And we're kind of anticipating and we're looking at risk factors and assessing. So why don't you map out for the audience here what's broken in cardiac screening today, just from an everyday perspective?
Yeah. So like I just mentioned, there's technology to find, well, you use heart failure, but there's all kinds of different layers of heart disease. We'll start with heart failure. The technology to find it exists today. It's largely if you give a cardiologist an ultrasound or an echo of a patient's heart, they can get to a conclusion pretty quickly. Maybe you need a cardiac MRI. 12-lead ECG usually in the hospital is done pretty commonly. But all those tools are in the hospital, and for sure. Most of the doctors are kind of, and the best cardiologists in the world are kind of centralized in these big systems as well. So it's not necessarily that we don't know how to find it. It's not cancer or Alzheimer's or some of these other things that are quite tricky. It's just a matter of getting the people to where the tools are. And what makes it even harder in a case like heart failure, where 80% of the cases are actually found in the ER, is the symptoms are relatively benign or they kind of feel like old age symptoms. It's shortness of breath when you're walking up the stairs, or maybe some heart palpitations. And you go and potentially see a primary care doctor that you may go to every couple of years, and it gets brushed off, sometimes too easily as, well, you need to eat better. You need to be a little bit more active. You're just a little bit winded, or quite frankly, you're just getting old. Which is probably what my dad would hear. Like, yeah, it's tough to go down the driveway, but you're 75 and like I said, don't eat well and not super active. So this is what happens as you age, and it just gets pushed off and off and off until ultimately it becomes an ER visit, which in my dad's case would be heartbreaking because, like I said, he's in the middle of nowhere. Effectively, the EMTs are volunteer. Leading to his house is a mile and it's gravel. So imagine a big ambulance kind of traveling down this hill to go find him, and then a couple hours to the closest hospital, which truthfully most likely is not the hospital he'd end up at. He'd stop there and then either go to Louisville or Lexington next, most likely. So importantly, and you kicked it off at the beginning, the point is right that the science is largely behind us. It's just how do you get that in the hands and in the communities that need it, as opposed to waiting for the people who can make it to the hospital.
Yeah, so let's kind of bridge then. So what have you and the team developed as your solution for this?
Yeah, so we have a 3-lead ECG patch. So I'll grab and I'll put on the screen here. So it's a ECG patch that you wear kind of right on the center of your chest, and it collects ECG, and we have a new device that's being reviewed by the FDA right now, that picks up a few other things, an accelerometer and respiratory impedance and a couple other things. But importantly, the geometry of the design of the device allows us to derive all 12 leads. So think about now you've got this kind of electrical volumetric view of the heart, which is really important to understand function. And then our CTO, a guy named Sandy Piccolotti, a brilliant guy, has spent most of his career first with NASA, some work with the Department of Defense on ultra-weak signal processing. So tools that he had built for detecting IEDs in highly forested areas for the Department of Defense, we then apply to our signal to say, hey, there's for a long time, a lot of belief that there's very very subtle signals in the ECG that tell you everything you need to know about cardiac function, and even some theories into neuro and kidney and a bunch of other places. But the signals were always way too messy. So us being able to apply these signal processing tools, now you can kind of get this ultra pure signal. And then importantly, like I said, that for 50 or 60 years, there's been a lot of research on what ECG should be able to tell you. So when we take some machine learning tools and you got theories on, let's say, how do you measure cardiac outputs and how to blood you're pumping out of your heart with a device like this, it existed in the academic sense, and it's been collecting dust on a library shelf for 30 years, but nobody ever had the tools to prove that it could actually work. And we've kind of done that with our signal processing in the device today. So maybe the academic theories maybe weren't perfect, but this is the beauty of the timing of everything coming together. Is you'd say, all right, there's 5 different theories, and you got kind of our own research and a lot of the machine learning tools, which allow you to do the compute on this really inexpensively now, could say, hey, it may be this lead, the V2 lead instead of the V3 lead that's really important. Or it could be this property, the ST elevation in the ECG that's really important versus QRS, some element of the QRS complex. It's kind of like a little bit of luck for sure, business-wise, that all this is coming together at the right time. But like you mentioned, like a lot of this stuff has existed in different contexts for a while. And when you marry it together, all of a sudden you can start to get insight into cardiac function that required echoes as of today, and required cardiac MRIs. In some cases, requires catheters that you snake into the heart to really understand hemodynamic stability. And it's our goal to be able to bring all that together in this device and do it really, really inexpensively.
And so the device can be used both in the physician's office setting as well as in the home setting. Is that right?
Right. Right. I'd say more often than not, these sit in, let's say, the cardiologist office today. And if you go see a cardiologist, you say, "Hey, I'm having heart palpitations," or if they suspect you may have an arrhythmia, which is a lot of these ECG wearables kind of were invented by a couple of really fantastic companies to detect arrhythmias earlier. Then they'll put the patch on in the visit, and then you go wear it however long the doctor would like, some 3 days, some 7 days, some 14 days, some 30, with the intent of, finding an arrhythmia and a regular heartbeat. When you're doing a 12-lead ECG in the hospital, the chances of finding it in that 10 seconds is quite small. But if something's happening in real life, you'll be able to pick it up. So that's primarily what happens. You can also put it on at home. So we'd get on the video, kind of like a HIPAA secure video teleconference with you and walk you through putting the device on at home as well, with some thoughts in the future about how do you do that without requiring me to be on the phone with you, but have an app guide you to do it. But can exist in either way.
Yeah. And that's something, the device is reusable. Is that right?
It is. It is. Yeah. The device as it was initially designed, the one I just showed, is reusable. Let's say a handful of times, and then the one that the FDA is reviewing right now, we think can last up to 50 times, going out in these 7 to 14 day context. So that's an important part of us keeping the cost low.
And the alternative for patients today not using your device, they might have a Holter monitor put on at the office and then have to take that home and kind of wear the whole apparatus for whatever the time period is.
Yeah, that was the standard of care for the longest time. And for those who haven't seen it, it's essentially you feel like you have a cassette recorder on your side, and you got lead wires, kind of stickers all over your body. So that still exists, and maybe, I don't know, 1 out of 5 cases, clinicians will have the patients do that, which is tricky because the signal is super noisy. As you can imagine, it's not terribly convenient, and you've got these wires all over you for a while. There's a couple companies, iRhythm in particular, that kind of revolutionized having a patch instead of having all these wires. And they do a fantastic job. It's really a super discreet device that kind of led the market, and they're leaders for sure today. And they're fantastic at arrhythmia detection. So that's what a doctor would most likely use. And as we roll out, that's who we compete with today, but more out of necessity than anything, because ultimately our goal is to do more than just the arrhythmia detection and be able to understand structural and hemodynamic and sleep kind of aspects of cardiac function all at one time. Importantly, using the same workflow, so we're not adding any burden on the clinician as well. But that's the path we'll likely use here for the next years.
So when we think about kind of patient experience and, having it on for either a shorter amount of time or something that's just less intrusive in terms of the device itself and wearing it on your body, what do we think from a diagnostic point of view? Are we getting to kind of those early signals faster in the process to kind of help the patient along and map out a care plan? Or what benefits are you seeing from not just the patient experience, but kind of what comes after?
Sure. So patient experience wise, it's really important. I mean, the device is relatively lightweight and the adhesive is, to the best of our ability, very gentle with the skin. But for sure, like, it's not like a Whoop bracelet where you can just wear it around and forget about it. So it's important to us to have, and what kind of helps with our signal fidelity is we think we can find most of this in as quick a manner as possible. Now, some of it, in arrhythmia as an example, you have no real control over when it shows up. So there are certain things that it's appropriate for the doctor to say, I do want to watch this for 14 days, or I do want to watch it for 30 days to see if there's a particular pattern that comes that maybe we wouldn't have seen if you only did it for 3 days. But for us, as we get into more of the structural and hemodynamic context, a lot of what we're building, we need 5 minutes of data. But with 5 minutes of data, ultimately what we'd love for this to be is just a tool, hopefully in the primary care space, where you're just putting it on quickly. You get a complete cardiac profile on the patient, and a primary care clinician can very quickly say, yep, I need you at the University of Kentucky, or no, everything looks good. That way you're not dealing with wearing this at home. You're not dealing with, if you're a swimmer, you have to avoid swimming for 2 weeks if you have the device on. So the more power we can get out of as short amount of time as humanly possible, we think is important. And that's what we kind of challenge ourselves to today. So 5 minutes is what we think we can do. I'm always trying to push it shorter if at all possible, because of course, cycling through these primary care visits, urgent cares, EDs, all these kind of environments that we think we could have a huge impact on, requires us not disrupting, a very tight process that exists today. So always fighting to get it shorter and shorter.
So we talked about kind of patient experience and what's new and different for them and some of their benefits. What are you hearing from the cardiologists as you work to roll out the product with them and give them a new tool to do something that they've been doing their entire careers? Maybe a little resistant, I'd have to imagine, for some of them, or kind of skeptical in some ways.
Skeptical for sure. And that's where a lot of the work we're doing, I kind of bucket as explainable AI. So we're looking for very specific things with the signal, and we can lean back on research that most of these cardiologists and electrophysiologists are somewhat familiar with when they were coming through school. So that way we can say, hey, we detected heart failure in this patient as we go through some of these trials, and here's what we saw that led us to that conclusion, which then they can kind of dimensionalize in terms of like, yes, that is what you would expect to see if a patient was in early stage heart failure, as opposed to a computer saying, your patient has X, and we're not exactly sure why the computer came to that conclusion, but we've done a lot of training and it's probably right. That I think is a trickier model to win. So I say skepticism for sure, but usually that we can talk through, and the science can break through that. Importantly, from a workflow perspective, we want to match exactly what you do to monitor arrhythmias today. So if you're going to pick a product X, pick us instead. And not only can we do arrhythmias, but in the future, we'll be able to give you all this other context. And I think one doctor who's been exceptionally helpful to us from the Minneapolis region, the way he described it was, the arrhythmia monitors, a lot of the monitors you have today, is a little bit like looking through a keyhole into the patient's health. And with all of this kind of expanded context, you guys are giving me the opportunity to open the door. And you said it, and it's exactly right. It's like the whole goal is, if you have all of the context, if cardiac care, in another analogy, is like the super confusing puzzle of a lot of pieces, and you're collecting the pieces over 2 years, of appointments. If you can smash that all down into a 5-minute study, then essentially it's a superpower for the cardiologist to get to care fast, and get to a procedure if you need to. Generic drugs can treat a lot of heart failure cases if caught early enough, but it's all about fast intervention to avoid worsening outcomes in this eventual ER visit down the road.
Well, and I think also the thing you touched on is that, and just knowing from my own experience, in my family, it's usually not one thing that people are dealing with for a health issue. It's
No.
usually several things. And so, is there the heart failure, and is there, high blood pressure, and is there sleep apnea, and are these all these things that are probably undiagnosed, right? That now all of a sudden, if you can apply one device to the body for some period of monitoring, and we get all of this data that starts to give those indications. The body is obviously a set of connected systems, organs, right? Like how everything works together is obviously quite delicate, especially as patients get older, right? And kind of need more and more of this. So the ability
That's
to kind of
exactly right. Even heart
tap into
failure,
it.
like heart
Yeah.
failure isn't just a specific thing. It's a syndrome that requires usually a lot of things going wrong in your cardiovascular system to land at heart failure. And every week there's a new study on the damage sleep apnea can do to cardiac function. So you're exactly right. So if
Yeah.
you're treating something on the cardiac side, but you don't understand the patient's health, you may do an ablation to take care of atrial fibrillation, but maybe it was sleep apnea that caused it in the first place, and it's going to come right back if you're not treating it. So it's all collecting as much context as you possibly can to make a thoughtful decision. And importantly, we're not trying to replace ultrasounds. We're not trying to replace MRIs. Most likely, the doctors are going to take our data, and it's a shortcut to say, all right, here's what I need to go look for. Or importantly, most hospitals will tell you there's a 3-month wait time to get an echo for a patient. But if they need to get somebody in tomorrow, they can. They always can. But they don't have a thoughtful way to come up with, yeah, Mike needs it tomorrow and Chris is fine waiting 3 months. Mike for sure needs to be the first person in line for the sleep test because he came back with a disturbance index over 40. And Chris doesn't need one at all, so we can save the money because everything looks okay. So it's ish, but like how do you prioritize the right people to get them to care as fast as possible, I think is what's resonated most with the
Well,
clinician.
and I think also what you were just speaking to, it goes to the costs associated with all of this, right? So there is obviously, the high cost of the emergency room visit and the
Yeah.
emergency services and emergency cardiology and all the kind of emergency stuff, right? So how are you thinking about from just a cost perspective, and kind of managing that and what payers are willing to pay for, and obviously among the spectrum of tests that a doctor can order, how this fits into that, and the grand scheme of the economics of all of this.
Yeah, the ethos of the company is to be as low cost as we possibly can, and not in an altruistic kind of charity way. I think we can make money being low cost, but high volume as we go out and touch a lot of patients. So I think if my goal 3 years from now was to be able to kind of have my dad have one of these show up at his primary care office without being my dad as the reason that it shows up at his primary care office, it has to be low cost. So as we first commercialize, we're saying, hey, we're not charging anything different for some of these new diagnostics as they become cleared by the FDA than just doing an arrhythmia monitoring test. And we can actually do that at about half the price of what the market charges today. And then as we move forward, the goal would be, hey, if you can do this for 5 minutes in a primary care practice, it probably needs to be $20 or $25 for this to make sense. And they'll need to, even in that case, need to be work to get reimbursement for a clinician to get paid back the $20 or $25 we need to do for the reprocessing. So there's still development to be done, even at $20 or $25. But in our mind, that's kind of what we're working towards. We think we need that in order for this to work. And as we go and do more sophisticated kind of health economic studies, I think especially when you figure the right population, and you said maybe it's 70-year-old males with hypertension, like that population is likely 15 to 20%. If you go pull 100 of them, likely have some level of early stage heart failure or even advanced heart failure. And if you can go find it for $25, that $10,000 to $20,000 ER visit makes sense pretty quickly. So low cost is key to everything we do, and we trust if we kind of follow through on the vision we have, that we'll be able to do it in a way that makes clinicians money at the same time.
Yeah, and I have to imagine with payers sitting on so much data too, that they have that ability to run some either just, analytics or predictive analytics on a population that meets that criteria, like you said, to define it and kind of identify a potential care gap among this population to do some proactive and, if we're thinking about more value-based care models, right? Like there's an opportunity there to be proactive and try to head some of these things off. So payers could really be a partner with the providers in this if everyone
Absolutely.
works and kind of, the stars align a little bit.
Absolutely, especially as you get to the Medicare Advantage plans, that makes sense. The VA for sure, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the request of the payers, which is not unfair, is, hey, we know that heart failure and heart failure readmissions are one of the biggest drivers of cost in the entire health system. But we need you, Chris, and Peerbridge to show me that your intervention actually bends the curve. So that's the feedback we've got, which I think is appropriate feedback. So as we've launched a few of our bigger trials, that's the thought, is to say, if we can find it early, and let's prove we can find it early, are the clinicians acting on it and actually trying to catch it early to then avoid those ER visits down the road. And that'll take a couple years of effort and data collection to do, but we feel pretty confident that in order to make a big dent in kind of community health and more population health initiatives, it's key. You gotta be looking for it earlier and earlier, and for that to work in their minds, payers' minds, it's got to be really inexpensive and effective at the same time.
Yeah, and I think the application of AI here and being able to process the signals and strip out the noise, find kind of the good information, and then to aggregate and kind of work with that information at scale, right? The more data you collect from more patients, the more highly tuned the AI is going to be and kind of being able to predict and sense that more efficient, more cost effective, all the benefits we usually hear about applying AI to nearly any data set.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Good stuff. All right. Well, Chris, thanks for walking us through this real world version of earlier cardiac detection. Faster tests, clearer signals, practical workflows can really help close care gaps, cut avoidable events. If you want to learn more about Peerbridge Health, check out the show notes for a link to their website. And if this episode was useful, follow Health Tech Edge and share it with a colleague who works on cardiac programs or primary care operations. Chris, thanks for joining me today.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike.
All right. I'm Mike Moore with the Health Tech Edge. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.